And we're back. So back to some literary theory. Just a note for you guys, I'm going to be uploading these notes to you guys both as a link to this screencast and as an MP4 file. Not that it really makes a huge difference, but I was noticing that when I uploaded the link, if you play it, it gets laggy very fast. And I don't know if you're the same way that I am, but listening to things lag behind and it not matching properly with the lips and everything, it bothers me. Can't do it. So if you find that that's the case and it's driving you nuts and you're like, well, I cannot use these notes because I will go insane. If that's the case, use the MP4 because it's not linked to the internet. You can download it and then play it and it'll be fine. Okay. So today's little segment on our previous discussion, we talked about what literary theory is. I talked to you a little bit about how you've used a type of literary theory before your whole lives, really. Anytime that you were being asked to look at the text and only the text, you were applying a form of literary theory called new criticism, which is also sometimes called formalism. So if you Google around and find that term, that's the same thing. I introduced you guys to two approaches for literary theory: new historicism, which looks at works' connection to their historical moment, to their historical context, and feminist and sexual political readings of literature, which again connect things to their historical moment, but do so with a focal point on what that work of literature is saying about gender, masculinity, femininity, sexual norms, and things of that nature. Today we're talking a little bit about psychological theory and archetypal and mythological theory. Both of these are kind of interrelated because they both take cues from foundational psychological figures. So if any of you are taking psychology right now or have taken it before, if you've been in Walk's class and you've talked about Freud and Jung, these two figures loom large in these types of literary theories. Psychological theory is heavily influenced by Freud. So very often when we're talking about psychological readings of text, a lot of people who use these kinds of methods will think that we're talking exclusively about Freud. We're not, but Freud is the big one. So we'll talk about that a little bit. What psychological theory is using a psychological theory to understand a work of literature. So this takes its cues, its introductory cues, from Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud, if you've ever studied Freud before, and again, if you're in psych, you probably have, Sigmund Freud is kind of like the foundational figure of what we call today psychology. I mean, he basically gave us a lot of the initial framework for what psychology is and how it could be used. Freud's biggest contribution, apart from like the pop psychology stuff, like things that we've talked about, I think, a little bit before, like the Oedipus complex and things like that. The biggest contribution that he's had is this idea of a subconscious, though, that inside everybody, in the inner workings of their mind, there exists a framework that is your conscious thought, this tiny portion of like what you're thinking that you're actually aware of, that you actually have access to. But Freud also posited that there is this larger portion of your thinking that constitutes your subconscious. All this stuff that you don't really know, you don't really notice, you don't really see. It's underneath the surface of your thinking. It's there kind of as like this giant amorphous mass of stuff that's in your thinking, it's in your mind. It influences you. It controls a lot of the things that you do on a subconscious level, meaning like you don't know that that's the reason that you're doing a thing, but it's driving a lot of your behavior and it's driving a lot of who you are, a lot of your identity, a lot of your choices, a lot of the things that you attach to, a lot of the things that you react against. Freud also posited, and a lot of psychologists in his aftermath also had different terms for this, but stages of development. The idea that a person in the maturity of their development have different fascinations, fixations, things that they attach themselves very much to, and that they then move past those things and move into other kinds of areas, other kinds of fixations and obsessions, things of that nature. Freud is was scandalous in his own time period and remains kind of a controversial figure today, because the thing that he is probably the most famous for is his idea of an Oedipus complex, which we talked about back at the beginning of the year, if you remember, those many years ago, months ago, years ago, weeks ago, I don't know, whatever. It was a long time ago. Now it seems even longer ago. If you remember when we were studying Oedipus, we talked a little bit about a small section of Freud that I had you guys read on the Oedipus complex. And Freud was suggesting the idea that people have a horrific reaction to that play because that play taps into a primal subconscious fear that people have about their own sexual attractions to parental figures, childhood figures, that type of thing. And, I think I remember talking about it with you guys, and, most of you were like, oh, no. And yeah, because in the conscious mind, that's like horrifically taboo. But that's also Freud's point, that things that we have consciously can also be subconsciously held. That you can have these two things, and on the conscious level, you think like, gross, but on a subconscious level, it's there. And you don't ever want to acknowledge like this barrier between the two things. So what you're actually trying to do when you're applying psychological theory is you look at how characters and situations, plot points, different things that are taking place throughout the course of the book, the play, the novel, whatever it is that you're looking at, connect to psychological theories or psychological readings of how this would work. So when Freud was suggesting that Oedipus had this latent, repressed attraction towards his mother, and this, hatred, this subliminal hatred towards his father figure, that is a psychological. He was doing a psychological reading of that play. It was connecting it to his own theories. If you've studied psychology before and you find that Freud's ideas are interesting to you, you could do a Freudian reading of a work of literature. You could take a look at, say, like something that we looked at before was Hamlet. People will do readings of Hamlet where they will suggest that Hamlet is actually giving evidence of an Oedipus complex. So the way that he's repulsed by his mother's remarriage to his uncle. Some people have done Oedipal readings of Hamlet where it's like, well, he's jealous. He's jealous of his uncle / stepfather. And that's, you see, proof of this Oedipus complex that Hamlet has. You know, thing that you'll notice about psychological theory is that it's interpretive. And because it's interpretive, some people will read an interpretation of like, wow, that's it, man. That makes sense. That fits. And some people will look at that and scratch their head a little bit, like, oh, I don't see that. But the point is not like, is it ironclad? Is it definitive? Very little in literature and literary interpretation is definitive. What you're really looking for here, what you're really aiming at is it valid? Meaning, have you explained the framework that you're establishing well? Have you proven and connected it to the text in a way where I can see why you are making that argument? If you're doing that, then even if I'm reading it and I'm like, well, it's not my take on that book, it's not my take on that psychological theory, who cares? Like, it's valid. That's the point. Okay. I mentioned to you that, like Freud is like the big figure, but there are other psychologists, other people. Again, if you have notes that you've taken from theory in walks class or in your own personal interest, and you see how one of those theories might track or might apply to a work of literature that you've studied before, go for it. That's psychological theory. You can do that. Okay. So that's psych. I mentioned the other one that I wanted to talk about with you guys today was inspired by the work of Carl Jung. Carl Jung was a contemporary of Freud, and they split off, kind of famously had a feud. And one of the things that they feuded over was Jung's idea of spiritualism and how spiritualism can apply to psychology. A lot of that stuff, some people really connect with that. Some people are really, into his idea of the collective unconscious. And again, if any of this is of interest to you, it's like a little Google thing. I don't want to inundate you with every psychological theory that exists. But one of the major contributions that Jung had was this thing that I mentioned a second ago called the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious leads us into a discussion of archetype and mythological readings of literature. What's meant by this is the idea that all stories follow established patterns from myths to modern stories. So if we were in class, what I would have you guys do is play a little game that I like to call, Can You Guess the Story? It's not really a very catchy title, but I'm working on that. We'll get to that. Don't worry about that. But the game would go like this. I'm going to give you guys some plot elements here of a story, and you guess what it is. So if you had a story where, say, a young protagonist grows up in wilderness alone with, say, some adoptive parents. He's unappreciated by that adoptive family. And when I say wilderness, I just mean like, an isolated place, something like that. Not necessarily wilderness, not like the woods or something. Could be the woods, whatever. He's in an adoptive family. His adoptive family, they don't really appreciate him all that much. And then at some point, somebody shows up and tells him, like, hey, you're special. Really special. Actually, you're from a long line of really special people who can do really special things. And we need you for this quest. Really important quest. It's going to save the world or the galaxy or the universe or, magical kingdom, whatever it might be. And, at first, the character in question's like, oh, I don't know if I can do it, or am I good enough, or I don't want to. I have my life here. I don't want to be bothered. But then eventually, through a series of misadventures or something like that, bad stuff goes down. They get pulled into this thing, and then the next thing you know, they're all about it. They got to get trained. They'll have like a training figure. They'll have to go through like all this like training and stuff. And they'll be like, "You're doing it wrong," and they're like, "Oh my god, I'm never gonna get it right." And then eventually, like, they'll start getting it right, and they're like, "See, we told you, he is the chosen one," right? Like that type of thing. And then, like, wow, if this story's starting to get familiar to you, it's like, good, okay. And eventually, they have to square off against a dark, shadowy force, an evil character, if you will. He usually has some connection to like their parents, maybe their dad, something like that. And like they'll square off against one another again using their special weapons. And as they're squaring off against one another, usually the hero will suffer some sort of wound, usually an unhealable wound. It leaves a mark or a scar or removes a limb or something like that. And then in the aftermath, they'll have to retrain, they'll have to regroup, and then they square off against that person again. And the next thing you know, they reach a sort of spiritual apotheosis, a sort of perfected form where you realize that they were, in fact, the chosen one the whole time. And that they have maybe even made a sacrifice. Maybe they've died. Maybe they've, they've some sort of like big thing, but, they've restored peace and balance to the world or galaxy or universe or magical kingdom or whatever it is. Again, if this story sounds familiar to you, it's because you've heard it before. At this point, if we were in class, I would ask you, what's the story? And some of you will say, it's Harold Potter, or it's a Star War, or it's a, I don't know, fill in the blank, right? Some of you guys are really familiar with series and things that I have no idea what they are, by the way. It's like, it's like, this is a Percy Jackson. It's like, never read that, don't know what that is. Or it's a Reginald blah, blah, blah. It's like, I don't know what that is. What is that? I don't know what that is. The reason, though, that you can blurt out anything and it will fit is because it fits an archetype. And the archetype is the story of a hero's quest, which you might have even studied last year, depending on what you guys did your junior year. Hero's quest is something that you will often study. It takes a lot of its guts, like a lot of the theoretical grounding comes from Jung. I'm pretty sure, by the way, I'm going to hit the next button and all my things are going to show up all at once. Nope. Okay. Jung, as I said, a contemporary of Freud, made the case for psychological archetypes, meaning your brain is patterned. Like you the same way, like if you think of like a deer gets born, and within like a couple minutes of just being born, the deer will instinctively know how to walk. It'll be a little wobbly and everything. The next thing you know, they're running around in front of your car. Jung was making the argument that people have instinctive patterns themselves. They're complex and they're kind of jumbled throughout your youth, but that you would recognize them and that they sort of fit into a pattern that you have up here. And these he referred to as primordial images, these kinds of patterns or these kinds of story types, these kinds of images that you just instinctively like, wow, you recognize that one. So this idea of like a dark shadow figure, primordial image, the idea of a hero, reluctantly rising with their special weapon and blah, blah, blah. And saying, yeah, it follows a Jungian pattern. It follows a Jungian type. This was further elaborated upon by another scholar named Northrop Frye, whose work was then built upon by Joseph Campbell, who some of you, again, might have read last year, that there's a continuity of archetypes, that these things fit into established patterns. An archetype is really just a fancy term for a pattern. What Frye noticed in his discussion is that continuity exists among imagery from all over the world. So he was looking at a lot of religious iconography. And what Northrop Frye noticed is that religious iconography, even from places in different time periods and different places in the world, religious iconography follows these weird patterns. They have a lot of like overlap. So some religious figures, like say, demigods and, sort of people who are half god and half man, certain kinds of images, like, the kinds of like pictures and like visual images that you associate with religions are very specific to a religion, right? Like, that's like classic Christian image or classic Judaic image or classic Hindu, like whatever it might be, whatever the tradition might be. Fry noticed that like, wow, these images actually have a lot of overlap. Like they actually tend to, and we're not saying like, oh, this religious tradition stole it from this other one. They happened simultaneously on opposite sides of the globe. Weird. It's weird. So Fry's discussion was that the reason you see this overlap is because it fits into the Jungian pattern, that it follows, that you just sort of have this stuff ingrained up here. And when people are putting these religious images out there, they're tapping into something that's already patterned into your brain. So if you look at discussion of religious symbolism and imagery, he finds patterns. And that's really what archetypal analysis is about. It's about finding patterns. These patterns that, like, when you're looking at a certain kind of a story, you can see something that echoes or patterns itself after something else. So the work of archetypal or mythological reading is looking for the connections. Okay, what you're saying is that this story, which was written, say, last year, right, a really new, recent thing, this story is very much like the archetype of, and fill in the blank. You would have to do a little bit of research to find what kinds of archetypes you were discussing. You would need to see a little bit about how those archetypes traditionally work. And then what you would be doing is making an argument that your story, your work of literature, follows this pattern. You have to resist, however, the massive problem that exists in archetypal or mythological readings. The problem kind of goes like this. Let's call it the cereal box problem. So if I'm talking to you guys about archetypes, and the trick that I just pulled for you, where I started talking about, like this character, and you thought it was like 6 different stories and everything, right? Okay, well, that might be really interesting to you the first time you hear it. But after that, you kind of have to figure out what else it is that you want to say, right? So pointing something matches an archetype is kind of like me taking a box of Captain Crunch cereal and reading the ingredients to you, right? So I'll pick up the box and be like, Captain, cool, right? And I start reading the side panel to you, and it's like, did you know that this includes oat flour? If you didn't know that, you might be like, wow, oat flour, that's fascinating. I might also say, it's like, do you know that this contains corn syrup? Corn syrup? I heard that's bad. That's bad. Oh, fascinating. This also has yellow dye in it, number 20. It's probably my favorite of all the yellow dyes. You get what I'm saying? Like, I start reading the ingredients to you, and you're like, wow, okay, cool. But ultimately, if I'm not doing something else with this, if I'm not making an argument about what these ingredients are, what they're doing, or then it's not really all that fascinating. And the same thing holds true with archetypal analysis. If you're interested in this, if this is kind of like scratching an itch for you, you found this to be interesting, you have to do more than simply point out, hey, this story, it's kind of like this story. They're sort of the same. Hey, cool, nice. So what? Okay, and really, that's something to keep in mind for anything that you're analyzing with literary theory. The so what question. You need to answer that question. That's the conclusion of any essay. It's the main point of anything that you ever do is what's the big idea? What's the point? Where is this going? So if you're seeing a continuity of imagery, if you're seeing something that this story that you're looking at is actually something that taps into something that's older, you not only need to point it out, you need to explain why it matters. Okay, and that's the big thing that I want to warn you about when it comes to archetypal in particular, but really any literary theory, any kind of theoretical reading that you're doing. Don't just point it out, explain how it deepens the text. That's the job of the research paper. So we're going to stop here. This will be part 2. I will post this again for you guys up on our Google Classroom page, and you'll have access to it. The slides are all there. So again, if my head was in your way, you can check the slides. And yeah, hit me up with questions. If you're listening to these and you're kind of like, wow, I have no idea what that man is talking about. That's okay. I can be confusing. I know that. But let me know. Okay. See ya.